welcome, and hello, lovely to see you all. Um, I haven't spoken in public for many years now, since before the pandemic, and I'm quite nervous. So if I see you going to sleep, I will buck myself up and wake you up and finish quickly. I'm going to talk about Aldbourne and the Counts of Perche, and a little bit at the end about Perche on horses and Perche on wine. And I know some of you have heard of the Counts of Perche, and some of you probably have never heard of them at all. So I'm going to start by kind of going through my story, why I got interested, what sparked my interest in Counts of Perche. Well, I was doing research into Aldbourne during the medieval time, and the first place to go and look is the Victoria History of England. Volume 2 discusses and describes the history of Aldbourne. And what it says is, after 1066, Gita, or her son Harold, held the estate of Aldbourne in 1066. And this is verbatim from the history. It passed to William I, and after 1086 was granted to a Count of Perche. Aldbourne was held around 1135 by Rotrou, Count of Perche, who died in 1144, and passed with the title to his son Rotrou, who died in 1191, and to the younger Rotrou's son Geoffrey, who died in 1202. The manor was confiscated in 1217 after the death of Geoffrey's son Thomas, Count of Perche, at the Battle of Lincoln. In the same year, the king granted it to William Longspay, Earl of Salisbury. Another grant to Longspay, perhaps confirming the king's, was made by William, Bishop of Chalons, on Count of Perche, Thomas's uncle and heir. So in those 10 or 11 lines, we have the history of Aldbourne from 1086 until 1217, but absolutely no details. So I began to think, well, who are these people who I'd never heard of? And how come that they held the manor of Aldbourne? And what did it actually mean if you held a manor of Aldbourne and you were a Count of Perche? Where was Perche for a start? Luckily, when you start Googling these things, you come across lots of interesting information. And the first thing that happened was I came across this lovely lady called Kathleen Hapgood Thomas, who, as her dissertation to become a doctor, wrote about the Counts of Perche. She also wrote a book, Power and Border Lordship in Medieval France, and lots of other articles and research things. And then I Facebooked her and looked and saw that she was professor at Sheffield University. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. My son and daughter-in-law live there. If we go up to Sheffield, maybe I could go and see her. So I sent her an email. And she replied, which was very nice of her. And she said that she thought there was actually quite a lot about Aldbourne in her book. And that I didn't really need to see her to talk about it. Anyway, she was retired and she lived in Taunton. But she also said that she really enjoyed the connection between Aldbourne and the Counts of Perche, because when she looked into it, her forebears actually came from Aldbourne. So I thought, okay, I'm on my own with this. I can cope. And then I'm going to start with a picture, because I think pictures are always nice. I hopefully don't have too many slides with just words. And this is an interesting picture because it is actually the picture of death scene of Henry I, King of England. And Catherine Hopwood says in her introduction, during the 6 days that Henry I, King of England and Duke of Normandy, lay dying at Lyons-la-Forêt in November 1135, he was attended by the usual array of nobles, officers and ecclesiastics, made up the entourage of an Anglo-Norman king. Among these men was the king's former son-in-law, Rotrou, Count of Mortagne, a man of mature years, probably well into his middle age, and an experienced warrior who had participated in the First Crusade and had also fought, apparently with some distinction, against the Muslims in Spain. In his account of the death scene and elsewhere in his ecclesiastical history of Anglo-Norman, the Anglo-Norman historian Odoric Vitalis describes him as Count of Mortagne. By 1135, Rotrou himself was rather anxious to be called the Count of Perche and had been styling himself in that manner in his charters for some time. She goes on to say this confusion is revealing because it marks the final stage in the emergence of a new political unit as a disparate collection of lands, some formally controlled by Rotrou's ancestors and others not, which was being forged into the county of Perche. So we've learned quite a few interesting things here. Amongst these people, possibly is one of the counts of Perche. He was a knight, so there's only a couple who could have been, maybe this one or this one or this one. It's probably not that one because that banner doesn't resemble the ones of the counts of Perche. But let's go on. The land once described, that's interesting. What's happened to that? Oh, okay. Okay, I'll talk about that. What we learned about the discussion that I've just read out, two things were interesting. One is that this Count of Perche was the son-in-law of the king, also that he fought a crusade and that he fought in Spain. And there was this land emerging in France, which was the land of the Perche. So where is this? Well, the land once described as the county of the Perche lies around 150 kilometers west of Paris. There's Paris. It has no administrative equivalent today, but falls into the modern département of Orne, Yoi, Loire, and Soitre. However, to this day, it contains a sense of regional identity, which defies modern boundaries. It still has this identity and is a popular holiday destination. Now, I know this to be true because Alan Huseman showed me a travel brochure, and on page 18, no, 28, what do we have? A whole article about going on holiday to the land of Perche. And it looks amazing. The guy who wrote it never actually got to anywhere really interesting. He never got to where he was going because he enjoyed everything so much. He just stayed in eating and drinking at these little bistros and enjoying himself. He was going up to go to a museum and he never made it. So that's a bit of a shame because I wanted to know what they had in that museum. So definitely it is still there. It still has its own identity, but it isn't an actual department. And moreover, by the 16th century, Coutume du Perche, which is a compilation of customary law, was published and used in this area. So it was a very important part of France. So how did this happen? Well, by the turn of the 12th century, a band of territory from Mortagne to Nogent-le-Rotrou formed the basis of the Rotrou lordship. The Rotrous themselves were particularly well placed to profit from this localization of public power. Their territories lay at the margins of the great power blocks of Normandy, Anjou, and Blois-Chartres, which had come to dominate northern France in the 11th century. And their very remoteness meant that the family could escape the control of the king and the great princes alike. And that is important because later on we will discover when those situations were not there, when the land of Perche was not isolated, and when the king became powerful, the French king became powerful, they began to lose their own power in that area. So this evolution occurred because the Rotrous took the opportunities presented by chronic instability to establish themselves in the 10th and 11th centuries and secure a preeminence in this area. Well, the chronic instability, of course, was caused by the Norman invasion of England and the continuous fighting of the English kings to get their French lands back, and the French kings trying to stop them doing it. And they kind of were right at the middle of this political toing and froing, and very cleverly manipulated their land and themselves according to who had the most power to make sure that they profited from all of these situations. So this is not a very good hereditary list, but I'm going to just go through a few things. So we have here, this is the one, by the way, which is in Kathleen's book. And I know that on the website, some of these numbers of these counts of Perche don't match up to what Kathleen has on this timeline. I'm going with her because I'm more familiar with this. Geoffrey, he's the one who probably fought with William the Bastard. He has two sons, Hugh and Rotro I. When he dies, the land of the Perche is divided between the two, which really wasn't a very good idea. Because if you want to be, in control, you want to have one main leader. But Hugh died quite soon, so that was okay. Rotro took over, and he has 6 or 7 children at least. He had Geoffrey, who was quite important, another Rotro, who actually married and then went off and became important in a different part of northern France. So, excuse me, I wonder whether the different numbering isn't because some people count him as Rotro II. Rotro, who I call Rotro II and other sources call Rotro III, is a very important person. And he is the guy who has Matilda, illegitimate daughter of Henry I, King of England, as his first wife. And that's pretty impressive, isn't it, for a king to give Count of Perche. She was illegitimate, but still, these Norman kings actually were very good at supporting their illegitimate children. They could never become king, but they certainly were very loyal, and the kings were often very good to them. Their first 2 children were called Philippa and Felicia, and Philippa had a daughter called Beatrix, who we will know about soon. Then Rotro married Hawisa of Salisbury. Now, again, Hawisa of Salisbury, that rings a bell, because we know that the Earls of Salisbury were involved in the history of Aldbourne in the next century. Their children were Rotro III, Geoffrey and Stephen. There are quite a lot of archbishops and deans and bishops in the Rotro family, but then that's in the Middle Ages, that was quite normal for the 2nd or 3rd sons because they had no other thing to really do that would bring them a livelihood. Geoffrey III then came along. There's another Geoffrey here, which I forgot to mention, by the way. Yes, this Geoffrey, he's an interesting guy because he's not given a number, but later on you'll discover that he actually played quite a big part in Aldbourne history. Geoffrey III, now this again is interesting, if you can see it. Count of Perche married Matilda, niece of Richard I. So we have another king giving a relative to somebody interested and somebody important in Aldbourne history. We have Stephen, we have another Rotro, Theobald, William, and Moravia, and then their son is Thomas. And if you remember from the previous slide, Thomas was the last of the Counts of Perche that we really know a lot about. So we want to find out more about all of these people and what their relevance was in Aldbourne history. We had a quick look at what the Victoria history said were the important people. These are the people that Kathleen Thompson says are important. We have Geoffrey, Rotro I, Geoffrey II, Rotro II, who was also called the Great, Rotro III, or the Less, it was less great, Geoffrey III. Then we have Matilda of Saxony. Now, we've just learned that Matilda of Saxony was the niece of Richard I, who married Geoffrey III. And she was important because she took over when her husband died and Thomas was still in his minority. And then we have Thomas. And after Thomas, we have the Bishop William of Châlons en Champagne. Because he was a bishop, he couldn't have any children. So basically the line dies out then. There were lots of other Rotrews. There were lots of cadet families with Rotrews. And they also have connections to Aldbourne. I'm not going to talk about them today because I really don't have time. So let's continue. In my endeavours to find some original documents and perhaps to work out who's right about which one was Godfrey I and which was Godfrey II, I found this, which is an original account of some of the documents relating to the land of the Perche. It was actually written around 1566. What it is an accumulation of all the different charters and acts and things. And this particular version was published in 1890. I got very excited. Even though it was written in French, I thought, you know what, I'm going to learn an awful lot from this. So I did read several of the 400 pages, but I didn't really come up with very much interesting at all, and it just got me more confused. I thought, forget that. But what I did like was this lovely picture of Mortagne, because I thought, you know what, that is so lovely. And we know that the two important towns in the county of the Perche were Mortagne and Nugent-le-Rotrou. And we know that the land was hilly, and you've got lovely hills here. You knew that it was fertile, and you've got rivers, and it was quite green and luscious with lots of woods, which it is still to this day. And here are some of the woods. We also know that most of these documents related to church quests by the Counts of Perche. And it's rather sweet that you've actually got 1, 2, 3, 4 churches very prominent in this medieval, well, middle age, late middle age, drawing representation of La Vie de Mortagne. And I think that must be the castle down there. Yes, that's the castle down there. So that was quite fun. I thought that's worth looking at. Early Perche history. Geoffrey I probably came over with William the Bastard and fought at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. But he didn't stay. We know this because he's not mentioned in the Domesday Book. If Norman knights came over and fought with William at Hastings, they were mostly rewarded with quite extensive land grants. There are none which show in the Domesday Book. So if he did come, he went back to France afterwards. His son, Rotrou I, had 7 children, of whom Rotrou II, or the third, according to your source, 1099 to 1144, was a fierce warrior, an ardent supporter of Henry of England. And this is the mainstay of the Rotrou policy all this time, is to support kings of England and to help them win their lands in France and hopefully be given rewards. We know also that he fought in the First Crusade and supported his cousin, King Alfonso, by fighting in Spain. Both of those things become important later on. So remember those 2 things that he did. While he was away in Spain, it is probable that the Perche lands were looked after by Rotrou's mother, Beatrix. And there are many of these women who step in and look after the lands while their men are off doing other things. And it's very telling that women at this time did have power, and they were allowed to have power.
I want your pointer back.
Oh, I want my pointer back. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
What?
At the top.
2. Thank
That's
you.
it.
Lovely. Thank you. Now, this is the exciting bit. This is where it starts getting really relevant for Aldbourne. In 1105, Henry I gave Rotrou II, Count of Perche, his illegitimate daughter Matilda in marriage, and he gave Aldbourne and Wanborough as her dowry. In Domesday, Aldbourne was assessed at 40 hides and paid £70 revenue. Wanborough at 19 hides and was worth £18. So they were lucrative. This was a lucrative place. They were lucrative manors. It showed how esteemed the Counts of Perche were, and also their importance to the Norman kings. Henry was actually buying Rotreu's support in France. He was needed to keep Henry's borders safe. Unfortunately, there is no record of any settlement in England by the Percherons. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could point to a house here and say, oh, that's where they used to live? No. But Matilda appears in 5 charters with her husband. In one, she is described as the daughter of the King of England. She also requested a hide of land from the Wanborough estate to go to the Cluniac Priory at Lewes, which had been, which was very much favoured by the Rotrews. And Rotreu donated a hide at Broome in Wiltshire to the nunnery Marsigny. Yes.
Sorry, Liz, I don't know what hide is.
You don't know what hide? Okay. Hide is a piece of land much favoured by medieval times, like we have an acre. They would have a hide. I will ask John if he knows exact yardage in a hide.
Exact definition of a hide, but it's basically the amount of land that would be needed to keep one household in whatever it needed for a year. Yes, a small holding is probably 100 acres or so. Thank you.
But it
varied depending on what kind of land.
Yeah, exactly. It varied according to which part of England you lived in. But
thank you.
Yes, please, if there's anything you don't catch, please do ask as we go along. We also know that Rotreu gave 20 shillings annually for the revenues of Aldbourne to the monks of Lewes, mentioning his wife by name, along with his father and mother. Now, was this in memory of her? Because it does seem rather strange, the wording of this particular bequest infers that this is a kind of a memorial bequest. So the next slide is the White Ship disaster. Now, I don't know whether any of you have heard of the White Ship disaster. It features quite a lot in books. This is one written by Charles Spencer, Diana's brother, who writes history books. And that's quite interesting. Doesn't mention Aldbourne very much, though. I was most disappointed. I thought there'd be lots about Aldbourne, but there isn't. What we know about the White Ship disaster was that it was the worst disaster of the Middle Ages. It cost 300 lives. King Henry I was at the peak of his power, having control of both England and Normandy, and having convinced the French king to acknowledge that his son, William the Eighthling, would succeed him as Duke of Normandy. So this is pretty important for Henry. In November of 1120, after 4 years of fighting, King Henry and his party, which included William and his half-sisters, his half-sister Matilda and half-brother Richard, prepare to leave England from Barfleur. One report suggests that close to 300 people were on board and about 50 crew. Now, unfortunately, these were very young people. All the young of that era, all the knights' young children were there. There'd been a lot of carousing. There'd been a lot of drinking and partying. And they'd given a lot of drink to the sailors. And no sooner had they got on board quite late in the evening, they shouldn't have gone because it was getting late, it was getting dark. They set off, and the first thing they did was run across some rocks, and the ship sank. Everybody died except one person. The captain is presumably could have been saved, but he preferred to die because he didn't want to be blamed for this awful catastrophe. The other story, and this is from Oderic again, I think. Yes, this is another story from Oderic. that William actually had escaped. He had gone off on a little boat, but he heard Matilda crying for help, and he persuaded the people in the boat who were with him to row back. And everybody who was trying to escape from the ship jumped onto the little boat, and they all sank. Oh. So it was a real catastrophe, because Henry didn't have anybody to succeed him. And if you go on to the next picture, this is really sad. We've got William at the top, and this is often the picture you have of Henry I, brokenhearted because his young son, he was 17, had died. And this is the ship going down under the waves. What happened next, of course, was the fact that who Henry did have was his daughter Matilda, who was married to the Holy Roman Emperor. He had said, he then married again, Henry married again, a very young woman, never had any more children, and decided that Matilda should take over being king when he dies. But when he does die, Matilda is busy having babies and looking after her husband, the Count of Anjou. The Holy Roman Emperor was dead by then. And she can't really go to England to establish herself as queen. Her cousin, Stephen, who is the son of one of Henry's sisters, rushes over to England and says, here I am, I can be king, gets himself crowned. And then we have the fighting between Stephen and Matilda, which lasts for the next almost 20 years and is called the Anarchy. It was a nasty time, a difficult time. Rodrigo, bless him, doesn't marry again for another 15 years. This is when he goes off and fights in Spain and does other things. But in 1135, he decides he will marry, and he marries Hawissa of Salisbury. You may say this is a bit of a come down from a daughter king, but in fact, the Salisburys were important families, especially in Wiltshire. And what they could do was help him maintain his English manners in Wiltshire. So it was quite a clever thing to do. I've put 1139, Rodrigo came to the court in Oxford, because we know he was in England at that time. And also at that time, Hawissa's parents, Walter, and I can't remember her mother's name, had founded a priory at Bradenstoke. And this is when they actually did the founding ceremony. And it's nice to think that possibly Rodrigo, who we know was in England, went down and actually took part in this foundation ceremony of the priory at Bradenstoke. And we have tiles from that priory in the centre, which are rather beautiful. And I just like to think that Rodrigo actually walked on those tiles when he went down to the founding of the priory. I know it's pretty, King John probably did, but it's nice to think that Rodrigo might have been there as well. So the anarchy which followed the death of Henry I, 1135, left Norman families in a difficult position, and having someone like Hawissa's brother Patrick of Salisbury to act for them in England was an important factor. On the death of Rodrigo II, 1144, Rodrigo III inherited, and he was a minor, which again added to the instability of their whole family. To overcome some of these difficulties, Aldbourne and Wanborough were given to Matilda's granddaughter, Beatrix. Also, Earl Patrick was related as well, but we won't bother about that. These families all intermarried. So Aldbourne under Beatrice. Now, this is somebody who I didn't know had anything to do with Aldbourne, and it's quite interesting that she was a woman. She was Matilda's granddaughter, and she had a husband called John, son of William Talvas, Count of Pointer. This we know that she had a role in running the manor of Aldbourne, because the pipe roll of 1156, now pipe rolls you can go and look at, they record tax which was exempted or tax which had to be paid, and who was going to pay the tax, and who the tax was going to get paid II, a writ issued by Henry II in or around 1158, ordering him to ensure that the Priory of Lewes would hold in peace the hide of land which Countess Matilda given them in the time of the king's grandfather. So we have a structure to say, an instructure to say, yes, you've got to pay this money for the Priory of Lewes. And it's quite nice to think that that was still going to be paid. There's also an undated act conceding land at Aldbourne to Odo, the son of Walter of Aldbourne, which was issued jointly by John and Beatrice. I have no idea who Walter of Aldbourne was. It would be really nice to try and find out. Presumably he was somebody quite important here or around Wiltshire, but we don't know anything else about him at the moment. So this time of unrest, the Counts of Perche were staying very much in France, and Aldbourne was being looked after by Beatrice, Matilda's granddaughter, and her husband. Now, when you think about medieval feudal systems, nothing stays the same for very long, because everything depends on the king and whether the king likes you or doesn't like you, what you happen to be doing, what the king wants you to do. And one of the things we know is that for the next few years, Aldbourne is not always under the control of the Counts of Perche. Henry II had taken action against troublesome knights on the border of Perche land and deprived William Talvas, John's father, of family land and castles. And he may have seized his English lands at the same time. However, the 1166-67 pipe rolls indicate that Count Rotrou held a pardon by the king's writ against charges payable by the community of Aldbourne. And the pipe roll for the next year describes the count rendering an account for 20 shillings for one borough. By 1169, Rotrou was in undisputed possession again, and we know that Archdeacon Everard was acting as his agent. So the counts would have had agents in England who would have done a lot of the menial tasks for them. And some of them were minor relatives, some of them were completely different people. By the 1170s, Aldbourne and Wanborough were in the hands of Geoffrey the Perche, and he received a pardon of 53 shillings 4p against charges payable for justice in Wiltshire. Count Geoffrey made safe these lands and extended possession of others, for example, Newbury and Toddington. Now, I didn't give Geoffrey a number because this Geoffrey was one of the minor brothers who didn't actually warrant a number, but he actually did a lot for Aldbourne, and he was very busy in and around the court. He was very well liked, and he put forward the claim for the Counts of Perche to be given more land, and he was very successful. They were given Newbury and Toddington. In 1179-80, Geoffrey died, and his property was seized by the king and remained in the hands of the sheriff until 1183. We don't quite know why. Maybe the king wanted a bit of money. He thought, you know what, nobody's looking after it anymore. I could do with some money. I'll take the revenue from the manor and keep it for a while. But in 1183, we know it was restored to Count Rotrou, possibly in recognition of Rotrou's role in negotiating with the young king. Now, don't forget, Henry II had terrible trouble with his sons. And at this time, they were rebelling against him. And it seems that Rotrou was quite useful in trying to get a peace between the young Henry and his father. And possibly in payment of this, he was given back the rents from the manors of Aldbourne and Wanborough. Right, we're going to jump a little bit. I'm thinking of the time. Okay, good. Do you remember we spoke about one of the Perche counts being married to Matilda, niece of Richard I? Well, this was Geoffrey. At the time they marry, Rotrou II is still living, and he is the count. but his son Geoffrey is given in marriage to the niece of Richard I. Now, this is a big coup. This is big. Not only is he given her as wife, but they're also given all the land which belonged to Henry of Essex. They become extremely rich and very important people. What you have to remember about Richard the Lionheart is that he didn't really care much about England. He only stayed 6 months in the land. So it was very sad when I discovered that, because you kind of Richard Coeur de Lion, this wonderful charismatic king, really the only thing he thought of was how he could get money out of England to fight his wars. And he twice bankrupted England. The first time when he got money to go on crusade, and the second time when he was imprisoned on the way back from the crusade, and he needed money for the ransom, and his mother collected lots of ransom money. So that was always been a bit of a blow, really, but he didn't do everything badly. One of the things in prison, when he was in prison, you know, John was getting very popular, and the counts had to decide, were they going to stay loyal to Richard, or were they going to actually start accepting John? They had to hedge their bets. And the one thing Richard did, he was very given to writing songs, singing songs, writing poetry. One of the songs he wrote goes, he's in prison at the time. My comrades, whom I loved and still do love, the lords of Perche and of Cailleux, strange tales have reached me that are hard to prove. I ne'er was false to them, forevermore vile would men count them, if their arms they bore against me, a prisoner here. So poor old Richard was quite upset because he discovered that the Counts of Perche were actually sucking up to John. So when he comes back, what does he discover? Yes, the king takes away the money from Aldbourne and Wanborough and keeps it for himself because he's a bit fed up that the Counts of Perche weren't completely loyal. If we go on to the next page, the next slide? Oh, there we go. What we do know, that they make it up. Richard doesn't hold grudges. That's one thing you can say about Richard I. He doesn't hold a grudge. And the revenue from the churches of Aldbourne and Wanborough were given to the Maison de Dieu in Nogent-le-Rotrou in 1190. 8 shillings annual rent at Wanborough was given to Bradenstoke Priory, where Rotrou's grandparents, Walter of Salisbury and Sybil of Charros, were buried. A grant of 2 vergates of land at Aldbourne was given to supply the wine at the Augustinian Priory of Southwark in Hampshire, sometime between 1194 and 1199. And Matilda is given a prominent place in this act. Quite like this idea that, you know, Matilda thinks actually we should, these monks need a bit of extra wine, let's give them some money. And a vergate, again, is a typical medieval area of land. I'm not sure whether I think it's smaller than a hide, isn't it?
I think it's smaller.
Sorry?
It's untilled.
Ah, okay. So I wonder how they would get money from it. It's certainly smaller than a hide anyway. On Richard's return from captivity, he found that Geoffrey had turned his support to John and the rents from his lands were kept back, as I already mentioned, but they soon made up, and pipe rolls for 1194-95 show the rents returned to Geoffrey. And the total sum of money accruing to him from his English lands is around £450 per annum. That's a lot of money. So that's in those days, so that they're worth having. So another difficult situation, Richard dies. There are 2 claimants for the throne after Richard. One is John and the other is Arthur, his cousin. What are they going to do? I think they have to decide fairly quickly because, I mean, John is in situ in the country. Arthur is in Brittany. And eventually, I mean, Arthur dies, possibly killed by King John.
Oh.
And that's another story. Did John actually kill Arthur, or did he have him killed? But by the Treaty of Lagule in May 1200, French King Philip finally acknowledged John as king. And we discover one of the guarantors was Count Geoffrey of the Perche. And for his support, Geoffrey was given £1,000. So this again proves how important these counts were to the kings of England. They relied on them for their support, and they had very prominent roles to play. Unfortunately, 2 years later, things take a slightly downward turn. Geoffrey dies, and Matilda is left running all the Perche lands. To start with, John continues to let her have the revenues and remittances of debt agreed. Now, John is her uncle, don't forget. She's Richard's niece, so she's John's niece as well. And she works extremely hard to keep on the right side of John. By the end of 1203, John is doing very badly in Normandy. He's basically lost most of the French lands. And he leaves Normandy, never really to return as Duke of the Duchy. He goes back to England to raise money. He hopes to go back to Normandy, continue war. But that doesn't actually happen. So we know he wants money, and he becomes more and more demanding as his need for money grows. In 1205, a detailed list of the scutage. Now, the scutage is based on the number of knights which each important knight in the country has to give the king, and the tax is based on this number of knights. And there's a very detailed list of all the knights which the counts of Perche owed the king. In time of war, you'd have to produce this number of knights. At other times, you would pay a tax. So John gets his treasury people to compile a list of the scutage owed by all the Rotrou knights. And unfortunately, he puts his own knights in place to control English lands of the Perche. Matilda fights back. She says, okay, I really want my English lands returned, because don't forget, by now it's not just Aldbourne and Wanborough and Newbury and Toddington. There are huge areas of Essex which they inherited under Richard I. She offers her uncle 2,000 marks for their return. It's a lot of money. And she starts the payments. And she continues to pay, and she continues to stand up to King John. But in 1210, she dies. Now, John turns very nasty here. This is one of the things that John has been blamed for. He did really extract money from the people under him in many devious ways. Disregarding the rights of his great nephew, Count Thomas, the whole honour of the Perche was seized. Aldbourne and Wanborough were assigned to Gerald of Attay, and the rest to Fulk and Antlo. Fulk undertook a regime of asset stripping, which reveals much about the rapacity of John's reign. In 9 months, £1,085, £1, 9.5 pence, was taken from Perche lands under his control. It's not sure whether Aldbourne and Wanborough were included in that. Because they were part of an original dowry, the laws regarding who inherits dowry land are a little bit different. And the kings were always quite careful to not necessarily usurp their rights over dowry lands. But that's a lot of money to have got in 9 months. And it was got not in very nice ways, you know, inheritances were sold, women were sold into marriage, timber was sold, many different things which you kind of know John did were exemplified in that asset stripping. So young Thomas is in a difficult situation. His great uncle is dispossessing him in England, and King Louis is becoming very powerful and successful in Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and parts of Poitou. So whereas before the Perche were isolated geographically, now they're not. What's Thomas going to do? Well, the French king comes calling to Thomas and says, look, I need your help. Both Thomas and his uncle were approached by the king. Come and help us, you know, don't bother about the English polities anymore. Come and help us. In 1215, Thomas comes of age and he commits to military action on Philip's behalf. King John died in 1216, and the war between him and the Barons' War, had begun in 1215. So the French have invaded England under Prince Louis, and Thomas makes up his mind he's going to go to England and support Prince Louis. He isn't with the first wave of the army who come over, but he is there at the Siege of Dover. That is known. He has a double motive, of course. He's supporting the king because he doesn't think he has any alternative, but he also knows that if the king is successful, he's going to get back his English lands. And as soon as they are a little bit successful, Thomas immediately asserts his right to some of his mother's marriage settlement in Kent and starts issuing rents to go and money to go to some of the religious houses in the area. He is very successful to start with. Thomas's French forces are successful at Winchester. They go up to Lincoln, which was holding out against the English forces within the castle. There are at least 3 different versions of what happens at the second Battle of Lincoln. It's a second battle because there was another one in the anarchy period. Unfortunately, what they all agree with is that Thomas is killed. And the English forces under William Marshall, which people might have heard of, were victorious. And Thomas, who was only 23, is buried quite quickly, and nobody knew quite where. And this is a picture of the Second Battle of Lincoln. This is one of the theories, that he was shot as he left Lincoln. Another theory is that he was killed on the steps of Lincoln Cathedral, not running away, but fighting bravely. What is true is that once he was killed, battle basically was over. And Thomas had made some strategic mistakes. He could have left Lincoln and gone and fought William Marshall outside the city, and it might have been different. Okay. One thing again is also we know is how he was valued. And there was a big outcry at the fact that he was given this obscure burial. The fact that he was dead, that he died, was noted in many contemporary English commentaries, including the annalists of Tewkesbury, Burton, Winchester, Waverley, Dunstable, Worcester, and even places further afield. Thomas seems to have been very popular. He was young, he was very much loved by Prince Louis, but unfortunately, once he'd gone, it really spelt the end of the French attack. There was another sea battle which the French lost, and William Marshall was successful. What happened next is a little bit controversial. On the 21st of June, 1 month after Thomas's death, instructions were sent to the sheriffs of Wiltshire, Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, that Aldbourne, Wanborough, Newbury, and Toddington, he'd be handed over to the king's uncle, William Longstay, Earl of Salisbury. We knew there was a Salisbury connection because of Hawisa, whose father was Earl of Salisbury, and whose brother, Patrick, was Earl of Salisbury. And William Longstay was married to Ella, who is also one of the descendants of the Earls of Salisbury. So he did have some kind of right to actually say to William Marshal, it wasn't the king really, it was William Marshal, the time, who was the regent, to say, well, do you know what, these lands should come to me because I'm their nearest heir. 1 month after that, the honours of Howley and Rayleigh, patrimony of the Earl of Essex, which had gone to Matilda, were given to Hubert de Burgh, but during the king's pleasure. And that again has been put in to show that if maybe a future Count of Perche might come back and be important again, they want to leave the gate open to renew good relations. And another footnote was that in 2017, William, Count of the Perche, Bishop of Chalon, sorry, 12, did I say 20? Oh, we changed that, didn't we, John? But not in this version. There you go. Is given a safe conduct to come to England, and it is believed that he was awarded compensation for the Perche lands. He was Thomas's cousin, and he was a bishop, and we know that he couldn't have any legitimate heirs. So basically in 1226, when William, Bishop of Chalon, dies, that side of the Perche lineage dies as well. And Aldbourne and Wanborough are given to the Earls of Salisbury, and Newbury and Toddington go to the regent, William Marshal. And William Marshal has always been set up as this epitome of courtly and knightly behaviour. And his own biographer says one thing that you can't really say was rather knightly was the way he grabbed the Perche lands as soon as Thomas died. And that's an interesting thing as well. I feel very kind of in tune with Thomas. I think this young man who tried to do his best, he changed the whole way that his family had looked after themselves and grown by switching to support the French king, and it wasn't successful. If the French had won, not only would Thomas have become very rich, we probably would have had a French king, and our whole history would have been different. So Thomas, the death of Thomas, had a huge role to play, again, in how the history of our country actually developed. But I said we were going to talk about horses. And here is a Percheron horse. And the history of horses is basically a little bit, again, confusing, because it may be that they are developed from mares captured by King Clovis I from the ethnic groups in Brittany in the late 5th century. Others believe that the Arabian stallions bought by the Muslim invaders during the 8th century formed the bloodstock. Moorish cavalry horses and the Boulonnais horses might have influenced the Percheron horses, but we do know, and this is also in the websites to do with horsing pedigree, local mares were crossed with Arabian stallions, and more Oriental blood was added by the counts and dukes of Perche. And this could have been during the Crusades or when Rothschild the Great fought in Castile. So it's quite likely that he brought back bloodstock, which he then mixed with other horses in the Count of Perche, in the land of the Perche, to form Percheron horses. During the 1600s and 1700s, horses from Perche province had gained widespread popularity and were used for pulling stagecoaches, hauling heavy goods from the docks to railway stations and for farm work. I tried to find a Percheron horse with an Aldbourne set of bells on them, but I couldn't find one. In the early 1800s, the French government set up a stud farm at Le Pas with the objective of developing army mounts, and a stallion referred to as Jean Le Blanc was produced in the Perche province in 1823. All the predecessors of today's Percherons are believed to have evolved from this horse. And they were in a very bad way. They were nearly extinct. And then people got together, and there are Percheron societies in all countries of the world, actually, dedicated to making sure that they don't die out. Luckily, one reason why they may not die out is Percheron wine, which you can buy in Aldbourne post office. The Percheron wine comes from South Africa, and why it's called Percheron wine is because they use the horses instead of tractors on the farms. The soft, I don't know how they can be soft when they're so big and heavy, but they don't compound the earth as much as heavy tractors and heavy farming machinery. So they are very much in demand for the growing of wine in South Africa, and they decided to call the wine after them. And it's really nice wine. Go and buy some from the post office. The last thing is if onlys and what ifs. I mean, if only there'd never been the White Ship disaster, the course of English history would be different. If only Thomas hadn't died at the Second Battle of Lincoln, the course of English history would be different. But there's also a lot more to discover, and I will continue and do some more research. I will get to see the pipe rolls, and I will go and look at what's in the British Library and look at some of the first-hand sources which talk about Aldbourne. And the other thing, which I think we should definitely do, is go and have a holiday in